The mainstream scholarly method of analysing the Bible is known as the historico-critical method, or historical criticism. The traditional name for this method of interpretation was higher criticism. Although it originated among pious Christians of the 16th and 17th centuries, higher criticism became popular in the 18th century when it became particularly associated with secular examination of the Bible. During the 19th century, it gained a bad reputation among conservative Christians as a result of being used by atheists, rationalists, and skeptics of the Bible. Traditional theologians typically felt threatened by higher criticism because its conclusions contradicted the traditional teachings of mainstream Christianity. Many higher critics concluded that the Bible did not teach an immortal soul, did not teach or support the Trinity, did not teach that Jesus was God, and did not teach of a supernatural evil being called Satan. However, by the end of the 19th century, higher criticism started to enter mainstream Christianity itself, and was even used by some conservative Christians who realized that its principles could be applied usefully without conceding the divine origin and inspiration of the Bible. Higher criticism is not theological interpretation. It studies the background to the text, such as the social, historical, and linguistic context. In the words of Dyson Hague, a conservative early 20th century Christian scholar, higher criticism seeks to identify, quote, the historic origins, the dates, and authorship of the various books of the Bible, end quote. It is important to note that this method of Bible study was not called higher criticism because it was considered higher than the Bible, or because it showed some kind of superiority of method or individual over other people. It is called higher in contrast to textual criticism, the study of texts in the source languages such as Hebrew and Greek, with the aim of determining what the original text said. Textual criticism is called lower criticism because it operates at the level below the text. So higher criticism is simply the collection of methods used to study the background of the Bible in order to gain useful information about its context before studying the text itself. As the conservative scholar Dyson Hague said over 100 years ago, higher criticism is the same kind of research carried out by everyone as they prepare to study the Bible. It is, quote, the author, the date, the circumstances, and the purposes of its writing, end quote. Think of higher criticism as a kind of toolbox for studying the Bible. It includes these useful tools: lexicography, study of word meanings in the text; socio-historical analysis, study of the social and historical background of the text; source criticism, identification of sources used by the text; redaction criticism, identification of edits made to the text; form criticism, identification of specific literary features of the text, such as genre. This may seem like an unnecessarily complicated way of studying the Bible, and something which only professional scholars would be concerned with. In fact, most of it is actually the kind of study just about every Bible student typically does anyway. Here are some examples of the application of higher criticism to Bible study, illustrating how the different tools are used. In 1867, Robert Roberts used lexicography to determine the meaning of the word translated perish in the Bible. He said that the meaning of the word, quote, is to be determined by lexicography and scriptural usage, end quote. In 1919, Charles Walker used socio-historical analysis to identify Jesus' reference to Jewish beliefs of his day in the parable of the rich man and Lazarus. He said that Jesus used language which was, quote, an accommodation to Jewish superstition, end quote. In 1875, Robert Roberts used source criticism to identify sources used by Moses when writing the Pentateuch, suggesting that Moses had used, quote, a written account of pre-Mosaic times, end quote, and had added this to information he received by inspiration. In the same article, Robert Roberts used redaction criticism to identify places in the Pentateuch where information had been added by an editor who lived long after Moses, explaining, quote, there are at least 2 cases where matter written after his death, in one case centuries afterwards, is inserted." End quote. In a book published in 1862, later reprinted in 1984, Robert Roberts used form criticism to analyze Jesus' parable of the rich man and Lazarus, saying, quote, "We must first realize, if we can, the nature of the passage of Scripture in question. It is either a literal narrative or a parable." End quote. This shows that the tools of higher criticism are not actually mysterious methods used only by professional scholars for incomprehensible purposes. They're actually the standard Bible study techniques many people typically use, just applied more systematically, deeply, and strictly. One more example will help demonstrate the successful application of higher criticism to Bible study. In 2015, Bernard Burt, a very conservative Bible student, wrote an article in the Testimony magazine explaining that the 19th century higher critics had been correct in their conclusion that the book of Genesis was actually made up of a variety of different written sources. Bernard started by saying, quote, "The evidence within the book of Genesis points to the fact that the so-called higher critics were right in their conclusion that Genesis consists of a series of manuscripts written by different authors, brought together and completed by an editor." End quote. Bernard applied source criticism and redaction criticism to the Bible in order to make his case. He argued that Genesis 10 and Genesis 14 were written before Moses, and that several passages, such as Genesis 14:3 and Genesis 50:10-11, show evidence of having been written by one author and edited by a later writer. Bernard even went so far as saying that there is at least one detail which cannot have been written by Moses and must have been added even later, quote, "possibly by Samuel." End quote. The Bible study tools which comprise what has traditionally been called higher criticism are the Bible student's ally. The modern term for them is the historico-critical method, and this is how they should be referred to these days to differentiate them from the less professional methods of the 19th century, which were occasionally tainted by personal agendas. Faithful Bible students have nothing to fear from this method of interpretation.